The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman is a chilling story that reveals the horrifying effects that a mental illness, if left untreated, can have on an individual, the individual's family, and society as a whole. The story is set in the late 19th century and is narrated in the first person by the protagonist, a woman who is a writer in her spare time and who has been experiencing depression. The story is presented as her personal journal. Her husband, John, who is a doctor, is convinced that there is nothing wrong with her but a temporary nervous depression, a slight hysterical tendency, and that all she needs is more sunshine and fresh air. So they, along with their baby and John's sister, Jenny, rent a large country estate for the summer. The room in which the narrator and her husband are staying has horrid yellow wallpaper. The narrator describes the pattern of the wallpaper as reminding one of a fungus, an interminable string of toadstools, budding and sprouting in endless convolutions. The windows in the room have bars on them, and the floor and bed are terribly scratched and dented, and there is a mark near the floor of the room where someone had rubbed the wallpaper raw that runs in a line around the entire room. Though the narrator detests the wallpaper, she begins to develop a strange fascination with it, more specifically, in deciphering its pattern. She watches it for hours, and over time, she begins to see the pattern take vague forms. At night, she sees it as a row of bars that keep captive a woman who creeps around behind the wallpaper, shaking the bars and trying to escape. Later, the narrator begins to see the woman in the daylight, creeping around outside the house. The narrator's thoughts and behaviors grow increasingly erratic. She begins to believe that she can free the woman in the wall, and she becomes suspicious of her husband and sister-in-law, who she sees as coercing behind her back to discover the woman before the narrator can free her. On their last day at the house, she locks herself in her room and tears away at the wallpaper, trying to free the woman. When she becomes frustrated that she cannot move the heavy bed, she gnaws on the bedstead. When she has finally fully descended into madness, she believes herself to be the woman in the wallpaper, and she begins creeping along the floor, with her shoulder pressed against the mark in the wall, creeping around and around the perimeter of the room. When her husband finds her, she cries, "I've got out at last, in spite of you and Jane, and I've pulled off most of the paper, so you can't put me back." She then writes, "Now why should that man have fainted? But he did, and right across my path by the wall, so that I had to creep over him every time." There are two main characters in this story, the narrator and her husband John, in addition to several small characters, chiefly Jenny or Jane, John's sister, and the narrator's baby. The narrator is the protagonist. She's a young woman who has recently given birth, a fact which we can gather from the fact that she has a baby that still needs to be cared for. She possesses a vivid imagination. This is revealed when she relates how, as a child, she would sometimes see the furniture in her bedroom moving at night. She has a creative, melancholy personality. She greatly enjoys writing, and her husband cautions her not to think about her illness because there is nothing so dangerous, so fascinating to a temperament like yours. As the story progresses, her symptoms grow in number and intensity. What begins as depression, including depressed mood, increased emotionality, fatigue, and irregular sleeping habits, grows to include more serious symptoms. She experiences both visual and olfactory hallucinations. For example, she sees the woman creeping around the house, and she claims that the wallpaper has a yellow smell that pervades everything. She begins having delusions, such as believing that there really is a woman trapped behind the wallpaper, and she experiences paranoia, such as when she starts believing that John and Jane are conspiring against her. In addition, she begins having destructive impulses, including suicidal thoughts, such as considering burning the house down to get rid of the yellow smell, gnawing on the bedpost in frustration, debating jumping out of the window, and proclaiming that no person touches this paper but me, not alive. All of these symptoms, in addition to the fact that she has recently given birth, lead to the conclusion that she is suffering from postpartum psychosis. John, her husband, is a physician by profession, and a man of science both in chosen field and in personality. In his wife's words, John is practical in the extreme. He has no patience with faith, an intense horror of superstition, and he scoffs openly at any talk of things not to be felt and seen and put down in figures. Because he finds nothing physically wrong with his wife, he dismisses her symptoms as a mere nervous condition. He forbids her from working, even from writing. He refuses to let her have intellectual stimulation by visiting her cousin, and he mandates that she spend long hours resting alone. Throughout the story, he refuses to acknowledge that there is anything seriously wrong with his wife. When she expresses concern that she is not improving, he responds with patronizing, belittling remarks, such as, "Bless her little heart, she shall be as sick as she pleases." His denial of her condition leads him to forbid his wife from even thinking about her illness. Thanks to advances in medicine and the study of psychology and mental disorders, we now know that much of his advice probably contributed to her condition rather than improving it. His environment of isolation that he created for her left her mind unoccupied, which left it a fertile ground for which the seed of the psychosis could now grow unhindered. This is a story about mental illness and the devastating effects it can have on an individual as well as society if it goes ignored. At the time the story was written, mental illness was not well understood. It was either dismissed as mere emotional weakness or was deliberately hidden to avoid public embarrassment and discrimination. The narrator's husband dismisses her symptoms since in his eyes they have no biological basis. He insists that her problems are merely a nervous condition and all in her head. He even forbids her from thinking about her illness. His refusal to even acknowledge that there is a problem is symbolized by the wallpaper. The wallpaper's pattern is described as like a fungus that bends around in peculiar and illogical shapes and leads nowhere. In describing the pattern, the narrator states, "You think you have mastered it, but just as you get well underway in following, it turns a back somersault and there you are. It slaps you in the face, knocks you down, and tramples upon you. It is like a bad dream." This is symbolic of John's denial of the narrator's illness. A fungus grows in the dark, away from sight, hidden from view beneath the earth. John, whether consciously or not, wants his wife's illness to be hidden from the eyes of the public. Like the fungus in the wallpaper, John's denial of his wife's condition causes him to make illogical conclusions about her health and twist the facts to fit what he wants reality to be. However, like the pattern in the wallpaper, his excuses lead nowhere and help no one. Similarly, at night, the wallpaper becomes prison bars behind which the woman, who is symbolic of the narrator's psychosis, creeps around. This further symbolizes how John's denial of the narrator's condition attempts to cover up and imprison the psychosis, though, as we shall soon see, this attempt is futile. Furthermore, as the narrator states, "Nobody could climb through that pattern. It strangles so. I think that is why it has so many heads. They get through, and then the pattern strangles them off and turns them upside down and makes their eyes white." This is symbolic of the people with mental illnesses whose society stifles and ostracizes by placing them in asylums where they are treated poorly and do not get the care they need, or by ignoring them, as the narrator's husband does to her. It should also be noted that the narrator says that the woman in the wallpaper at first only appears at night, under cover of darkness. Later, she is seen by the narrator in the daytime, but she hides when a carriage passes. Of this, the narrator says, "I don't blame her a bit. It must be very humiliating to be caught creeping by daylight." This further signifies society's attitude toward people with mental illnesses. Sufferers are taught to hide their symptoms or else be ostracized by society. When the narrator is finally able to free the woman in the wallpaper, the two have now become one. In other words, the mental illness has now taken over the narrator's mind. When her husband enters and sees her crawling around on the floor, she expresses defiance at John's attempts to keep her in the wallpaper, and she exults in the fact that she is free at last to creep around the room. Her husband then faints, and she continues to crawl around the room. creeping over his body when it gets in the way. This shows that his denial of her condition did nothing in the end. In fact, perhaps it made her condition worse, since by denying the existence of the problem, he was therefore unable to treat it. He ignored her illness when he had the chance to fix it, but now the problem has become so big that even he can't keep ignoring it. In the end, because he ignored the problem, it grew and grew unhindered, and now, both literally and figuratively, it easily crawls over him as he lays in defeat. The Yellow Wallpaper is a fascinating and suspenseful delve into the shadows of the human mind, but it is also a cautionary tale, one that still holds true today. Fortunately, we live in a society that is much more understanding of mental illnesses than the society of which this story is a product. Yet, there is still work to be done in educating the public about mental health. There are still many people who act like John does in the story, who are either too naive or too short-sighted, and who thus think that the problem of mental illness will be solved if they just ignore it. With this bearing in mind, one last point of interest is that the author seems to imply that the house's former occupants were also affected by the wallpaper. When the narrator and her family arrive, the wallpaper is already torn off in places. The bedposts are already positively gnawed, and there is already a mark around the bottom of the walls where someone had dragged their shoulder as they crawled around the room. All this seems to imply that what happened once could and will happen again. Illnesses of the mind have always been with us, and they will continue to be. Ignoring the signs of mental illness does nothing to help the patient, their families, or society as a whole. It only acts as a wallpaper, covering up the ugliness with more ugliness, and in the end will be powerless when it is inevitably torn down and the woman in the wall is set free.